Most people enjoy hearing the stories of cryptid sightings and encounters. Cryptids are creatures, such as Bigfoot, lake monsters, and even mythical beasts like dragons, griffins, or yes, mermaids. Lake monsters are infamous in most lakes across America. They've been known to terrorize whole towns and villages into ultimately changing the way of daily life and travel, steering clear of the waters or others such as Champy, who bring in tourists to want a chance of fame and fortune. There are certain places that you can buy Bigfoot magnets and keychains, and also postcards of the Jersey Devil. These, my friends, are the same type of people who enjoy tours of haunted houses and ghost walks, then return to their cozy homes and it's all over. But for some of us, it's a lifestyle. We don't talk about it. Well, we respect our monsters, and we have seen what can happen if someone does try to break the silence. I can tell you that my name is kind of under wraps, and even where I live, I'd prefer to keep that anonymous too. Just know that it is one of the northern states in the US. You will likely never have heard of our cryptid. There's a good reason for it. We don't talk about her. Yes, that's right, her. While most of these tales seem to involve creatures with no discernible gender, or people assume that they're male due to perhaps stature, ours is very much feminine. I remember the first time I heard whispers in the playground during recess about the witch in the woods and the lady in the lake. Some of the kids have heard stories from older siblings, and of course, there was arguments over who was right. Of course, it was neither of them. Our cryptid isn't a witch, and although I consider her female, she's not actually a lady, and she resides in the mountains. Only a few people have ever actually seen her, and those sightings are far and few between these days. Much like the old stories of mermaids and sirens, she appears as great beauty to start with, but soon, much like a succubus, reveals her true form. Those who have lived to tell, she doesn't apparently spare everyone, which is why hiking in these particular areas are forbidden. Say she is around 8 feet tall, practically skin and bone. What skin is left is gray and rotting, hanging off her bones, exposing her ribcage and spinal column. Due to her height, her limbs are extended, and her long fingers can rip a man in half. Despite the state of her skin, her hair is said to be wispy black and reaches long down, an almost skeletal-like face. The skin that remains is pulled tightly across all of her grotesque features, making her eyes stick out and displaying sharp teeth like fangs. And if all of that alone wasn't enough to frighten you, she also is said to have large, leathery black wings. She keeps those tucked behind her. If she opens them, run. Yet, despite all of this, her utter terrifying appearance, she leaves us alone. She never does venture down into our town, and we have been able to keep up on the bears and wolves in the caves to deter any strangers from deciding to take a hike up there. Some have said that she is a descendant of the Fae. Others may be a banshee. Look, whatever she is, I don't care. She seems fine, so as long as we leave her alone. Most of us believe her to be a guardian of sorts. We've had more than our fair share of good luck and fortune, minor miracles and the like. If somebody wins a raffle or gets all the clear on a medical exam, they give a nod to the mountain. But as I said, we have rules to follow. It hasn't happened for a while, but back, just before I was born, I guess there was a man who had tried to talk to a reporter about her from the city. I guess he somehow managed to collect various stories from her around town, even made a sketch, and plotted out some of her sightings on a map. He loaded it all into his vehicle and headed off to the city where he was due to meet the reporter. I guess he was somehow involved in a head-on collision, dying at the scene. The car bursting into flame with nothing left. 2 days prior, his wife had died of a heart attack. She was a gym teacher, 35 years old, very fit and healthy. Maybe these were coincidences, but our town doesn't believe that. I feel there's some sort of supernatural blanket laying on top of anybody who wants to investigate this further. We don't talk about our monster, and everything is fine. You won't find postcards or bumper stickers in our gas stations. If a stranger comes to town and asks about sightings of something strange in the mountain, we tell them about the wolves, the bears, the cougars, you know. Sure, we may even throw Bigfoot a bone here and there. Because the sheer drops and the dangerous caves, well, yeah. There is nothing unusual or unexplained in our mountains, we say. They are closed off. Too dangerous. You don't want to encounter an angry bear, right? Or trip over an unseen ledge, plummeting to your death, do you? I mean, it usually works that way, right? Unless somebody thinks they're brave enough to be a hero. They generally don't come back. We know what's happened. We did try to warn them. Of course, it does make me wonder. If we are one small town with a very big kept secret, how many others are there out there? How many more of these things are watching over people, keeping the peace unless spoken about? You think we're an exclusive instance? No. I had heard from many other stories. I guess there are small villages in Brazil and South America that face a very similar situation. Everybody knows about it, but they don't really mention it to outsiders. Except their beings they face are harpies, or female-like entities. I don't know if that's our case or how that works, but it's strange. And being a cryptid paranormal investigator, I feel that I should be finding these things out. Anyway, let's keep communication open, and I'll let you know if I find out anything else. As always, take care. This is my story. I get it, it's not the best, but I have attempted to tell it as close to accurately as I can remember. My name is Lauren Chambers. Obviously, it's not my real name, but that's what I'll go by for this story. This happened when I was 19. The beginning of this tale begins with a deceptively normal day in June at about 7 a.m. while walking my dog. At the time, I still lived at home with mom and dad, taking a year off before college, and one thing they asked for help with alongside regular chores was to walk the dog. Even though that meant getting up early, it was fine. And to be honest, especially during the summer, it was better to wake up before the sun got too hot, and I enjoyed the fresh air and exercise. You see, Duke was a yellow lab, and still full of life, enjoying his long runs and playing catch with a nasty old tennis ball that he loved. We usually always took a particular route through the woods behind the house, almost exactly an hour every day, and arriving home to a nice hot cup of coffee, as my parents were getting ready, being busy for work. Except on that specific day, the ball had decided to land way further away than usual, get caught by a gust of wind, and end up sailing down the stream. I would bet for any other pet owner, this wouldn't have been an issue. You could probably just fool your dog with another ball, right? Not our dog Duke. He'd had that ball for ages, and he would not stop barking and howling at me until I made the effort to try and fetch it out, which was how we ended up further into the trees and way down past the water than we'd ever been. Duke, of course, was having the time of his life. So many new smells and new trees for him to pee on. And for a short time, even I thought it might have been a blessing in disguise that we somehow ended up in this new, undiscovered part by us. There were far more trees on this side of the water, and even though dawn had been gone and the sun should have been shining through, I noticed it was much darker due to the sheer density of all the branches, leaves, and foliage. It was never exactly partly central in there. We were lucky if we saw one other crazy person with their dog, or occasionally a morning jog. But it seemed even less likely that we would come across any living creature, let alone a human. Duke was busy rolling in something I probably didn't even want to know about, when all of a sudden, he stops. At first, it seemed comical. He was just laying there on his back with his legs up in the air, looking like a beetle that had gotten stuck. Then, his demeanor changes instantly. He starts whining. I thought maybe he was hurt. He had rolled on a porcupine maybe or something. So, as I begin going over towards him, he suddenly jumps up, running back at me, barking and growling. Looking back, I realized he was trying to warn me. At the time, though, I was very confused and off-put by this behavior. Then, I heard another growl, only I was looking right at Duke, and I knew it wasn't him making the sound. My first thought was that maybe there was another dog out there, and of course this dog wasn't happy that we had found his secret space, or, something along those lines. So I quickly scanned all around, and I even called out. I had to see who was there. No answer, obviously. Just another louder and closer growl. I then noticed what we must be close to is the far end of the woodland, before it turns into a massive cavern system, eventually leading off to a huge lake, which actually used to be a giant quarry and had fueled many campfire scary stories over the years. I think mainly about ghosts and other spooky noises you could hear there late at night. I know. Being in high school and going through campfires, I'd heard all about it. Stories that'll make your eyes roll from being so cheesy. But now, that was becoming a reality. Screams from the workmen who lost their lives filling it in. The usual kind of tales. All sorts of things were going through my mind. It can't be a ghost. This isn't nighttime. It can't be. I'm not close enough to the water. All sorts of crazy stuff, and as I realized how hard my heart was thumping, I should have just run. I would have if Duke wouldn't have just gotten up and followed me. But he decided too that he was scared, and he would be all submissive and roll over on his back again, showing his belly to the growler, showing that he was a coward. And that's when everything changed. We saw it. It crawled out of the mouth of one of the cavern openings. It didn't appear much bigger than Duke, but it was crouched over, spine all bent, so maybe it would have been taller had it stood up. It was completely white, blindingly so, like fresh snow. I didn't notice a proper face, just sort of a hole. It wasn't human-like, but it had human features, like a human body, crouched over kind of crab-walking. It seemed to have limbs, but whether they were separate arms and legs or legs at all, I didn't hang around to investigate any further. It began to make this clicking noise. Well, its head was kind of pointed too, and again, no eyes. That was enough. Me and Duke bolted. We ran as fast as we could back through the trees and over the water. We didn't stop at all, not even to take a breather, until we got back home. Duke shot into his kennel, refusing to come out until later. I had to bribe him. For a few days, I had to literally drag him into the forest. Even though we were even barely made it past a yard, we never took the ball back again, just in case. Duke passed while I was at college, unfortunately, and I strongly advised my parents don't get another dog. I never told them or anybody else what we saw. But I know whenever I hear somebody hearing a ghost when they've been down to the lake, it isn't a ghost. I believe it's something far, far worse. The only thing I could think of is maybe I had a sighting of a crawler. It's the only thing that would make sense. What's your opinion? I am a woodsman. I'm a resident of the area near Farragut Park here in Washington, D.C. I've been living here my entire life without any problems from the so-called local wildlife, right? Well, my family and friends all live nearby. We work together as a community. and create a habitat for ourselves in this urban environment, whether it be nature areas to encourage the insects and for the schools to enjoy, or clean parks for family picnics and other outdoor activities. We may not be world-renowned conservationists or have endless amounts of cash, but we do our best, up until recently. You see, the wildlife has been thankful, or at least that's what I like to believe. We even had somebody come down from the local college to take a look at one of the butterflies spotted in this nature area. Apparently, it was a rather rare species, but now, not even the insects want to be around. You see, as much as I want to believe in the whole circle of life and that all animals should be treated kindly and with respect, there is one being that I would do anything to get rid of. Now, before I say anything, I want to know that I do have a small background in cryptozoology. I'm familiar with things like Skinwalkers, Mothman, Bigfoot, you name it. So, I know all about the Dogman, which is exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm here to tell you, they're very real. Listen, I know it probably sounds kind of nutty to even put those words together, but a dog and a man shouldn't be possible, right? I mean, we're talking about werewolf-looking beings here. But just all the stories, I mean, there are far too many witnesses here to deny it. Not that anybody would come forward. I mean, who would? Of course, at first, we didn't know what was out there. Just that something was causing a real mess in the parks overnight. I mean, there's all sorts of critters that can do that sort of thing. Raccoons can dig out your trash, bears can cause all manner of damage, and there had been numerous coyote sightings. What soon became apparent was whatever was entering the parklands, and was large and intelligent, as it seemed to be really good at avoiding any detection. Well, a couple of us even decided to do some nighttime patrols, just drive-bys of the area and such. Whenever we were about, whatever was out there seemed to know and stayed away. Then, it moved on to the yards and gardens of some of the residents, and that was when we finally got it caught on camera. I'll never forget the look on my neighbor's face when he knocked on my door and said he had something to show me. I wasn't sure whether he'd caught something completely different on camera, maybe a peeping Tom or one of his kids sneaking out, but it was not the expression of somebody who had discovered it, being a naughty feral cat, causing all sorts of trouble. We sat down to watch footage, and I realized why he looked so shocked. Now, this is in Fort Knox here, so the surveillance equipment and cameras we use aren't exactly the best quality. Just what we can afford to help deter would-be burglars and such. The picture was kind of grainy, and even jumped around a bit, like an old VHS tape from back in the day. But, although the creature he caught sneaking into his yard was shadowy, it would not have stood the test in a court of law. We could very clearly see large shape, the size and stature of a man. At first, I thought that this was and that we needed to take it down to the station house. What I saw had caused so much anxiety. Well, the man turned to look directly up at the camera, and it had the face of a wolf. Even in that grainy, flickering feed, you can make out distinct facial features of a German Shepherd, a face I know really well as I had one lying by my feet as I watched the tape. This dog, or whatever you call it, with a man's face, seemed to realize it was being recorded and ran off, leaping over a 6-foot fence like it was nothing. It would be easy to write off as some sort of prank, albeit that it must have been one hell of an expensive costume and mask. I mean, we're talking about a $1,000 costume easily. I mean, it looked like a man's muscular body, covered in deep fur, perfectly proportioned. However, over the next few weeks, there had been several more reports from neighbors and people in the town about sightings, whether in their yards or just if they happened to be driving about. Whilst the Dogman, as we came to call it, didn't seem to be causing any more harm than any other critter, there was one extremely important factor. Other animals, even insects and the like, seemed to be very afraid, and all of a sudden, there were way less birds flying around, less butterflies, less insects, less chatter from animals. It seemed like the wildlife took the hint, and they knew that this was some sort of abomination that was to be feared. We've yet to work out where it lives or comes from. Searches in groups in the woods around us have found us nothing. But as I said, I believe this cryptid is very clever. It knows how to cover its tracks. I'm not usually one for hunting something down, but whatever this thing is, it's scaring off every other animal. Either that, or we are dealing with an extremely intelligent alpha predator. These things work hard to make themselves concealed. It's evident this creature doesn't belong here, and if we truly are dealing with an alpha predator, God help us all. I, Jack Faulkner, my pseudonym, have seen what I can describe as werewolves. Now, I know you might write me off just from that sentence alone, and I can't verify that they are indeed werewolves. You know, shapeshifters under full moon, but the beings that I saw, I have no other way to describe them based on their physical appearance. See, I live in a town known as Hillside, and had this encounter only last year. I was out with my girlfriend Caitlin at a little local bar. This is where we usually hang out on the weekends in Pennsylvania. We stayed there for about an hour or so, just having drinks and talking to our buddies before finally heading home. It's important to note that whilst both Kate and I had had a couple of beers, we were by no means drunk, and what we saw sobered us both up super fast anyway. It was dark and late, and we hadn't even got to the bar till near closing. But Kate always enjoyed the scenic route. She liked taking it there and home, past this forest. It's really cool because buying this forest, there's an old church that she lives out there. Apparently sometimes it's even lit up at night. It's not used anymore, and no one knows who would bother to go in there and light the lanterns, but I guess it's somewhat of a tradition that every so often, maybe once a month, we just take a drive out there and see. So far, we'd never been on the right day. Well, I reckon I should probably go and do more digging to find out who actually goes out there and lights these lanterns. I mean, it's probably the owner or something. Maybe it's a warning. Who knows? Anyway, we were driving down towards the track that leads to the church, and I suddenly noticed that whilst I can barely see where I'm going, even with the headlights on, it is much brighter, which I commented on to Kate, and she points up at the sky. I think at that point, I even made some silly joke, and the noise like a wolf. We both laughed. If only we'd known. The moon, of course, was full. Again, just bleeding into this whole werewolf cliche, which, again, I'm not saying people who shapeshift into wolves are real. I'm just saying that the beings that we saw, I don't know how else to describe it. So here we are, getting closer to the little church, when Kate begins squealing, and we see that the lights are in fact on. It's not just a tall tale or a local legend. I mean, we'd been out here maybe 10 times since we heard about it. Never seen them on. I guess we'd never just been here on a full moon before. Maybe it's a monthly thing, I don't know. Kate was all up for jumping straight out of the car, but I had this weird, almost ritual, that I had to turn the car around and be in a position to drive away before I can park and get out. That little obsession of mine would save our lives. I mean, she's giddy in excitement at finally seeing the lights, and I finally parked and having maneuvered the vehicle for a quick getaway. Something my dad always instilled in me to having grown up in the Bronx. Always. That's something that stuck with me. Now, she's about to throw open the door when something instinctively made me put my hand on her arm and tell her to wait. She's about ready to kill me by then, chomping at the bit to get out and look closer at the church. when we both heard a noise. Everything about the sound just made my blood run cold. It was this low, deep growl coming from somewhere close by. Part of me wanted to put my foot on the gas and just book it out of there, out of sheer fright. But as we all know, it doesn't work that way. You know when characters make dumb decisions in movies, and you're always like, I wouldn't have done that. Well, until you're in a similar position, you don't got a clue as to what you would do. And right then, despite hearing a sound which can only mean bad things, we didn't move. Instead, we watched. Watched as three large, and I mean Dwayne Johnson The Rock type large, just add more muscles, figures emerged behind the trees behind the building. Do you remember that feeling you'd get as a kid when you managed to convince yourself that there was something under the bed or in your closet? That very real fear in the pit of your stomach that you likely don't experience as an adult, unless maybe you're a parent. That was how I felt right then, seeing these figures. Only I wasn't just a little kid who could hide under my covers and call for my mother. Just in case I was having some sort of psychotic break, I looked over at Kate, whispered really low, "You see them too?" She didn't even need to answer. She just looked at me, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Now, my girlfriend is one of the strongest women I know, and a real hardcore horror movie fan. I have never seen her so terrified. I mean, this girl is scared of nothing. Then these things moved closer. You might be wondering, how am I even able to describe what I saw so well? I mean, it was nighttime, and this only happened for a moment. But remember, the building was lit up, and it was a really bright full moon out. Plus, I still had the engine running and the lights on. As I said, there were these Dwayne Johnson size and height and build, only bigger, completely covered in dark fur. I'm not going to lie to you. They looked exactly like what you'd expect out of a Hollywood horror movie that featured werewolves. How did I know that? Well, from the fact that they looked like wolves, standing upright like men. I mean, they looked mean and massive. Then one of them stood and started growling, enough that it could grip your soul and terrify you. If I hadn't been turned around so that I could stamp on the gas and speed out of there, I don't think I'd be writing this for you to share. If I had to try and turn the car around before we could race back down the track, then they would have ripped off the doors and had us for dinner, I'm sure. As it was, Kate turned back into her seat to watch, see if they followed us as I attempted a Fast and Furious type escape down the road. They were all just crouched by the building, watching, like they did not want us around. Maybe somehow I think they were tied to that building and couldn't leave. I mean, who knows what the actual rules are for these things. Until that moment I thought they were something you only saw in the movies. Thankfully, I was able to get us home without crashing the car. I intend to try and do some research into that old and not so abandoned church. Find out just who lights those lanterns and what they might know about these things. I'll be sure as hell to be looking around at everybody else, and there might be other signs. The one thing I know about these Dogman is that maybe they are people. Maybe they once were people. I don't know how this whole thing works. I don't know. Maybe they're from the same pack. So far, I haven't been able to find out much. So, you seem to be an expert on the subject. Maybe you know more about these things. Maybe you know more about that if they live in packs and whatnot, or how that works. Maybe these are really werewolves. I don't know. Tribal Elder Malik, we'll call him, was a medicine man for the Bismarck tribe. He lived in a small village outside of Recluse, and oftentimes went on vision quests into the wild to find herbs and plants with healing properties that could be properly used by his people. This specific journey would take him far away, but was to gather a very specific herb to help one of the younger children who was having trouble sleeping, and when he did, suffering terrible night terrors that were affecting the entire family. They were good, hard-working people, and Malik wanted to help them and their young son get the rest and peace they needed. He was very important and well-respected. In the community, he was known. The people were grateful for his knowledge in both gathering and administering the treatments. He was used to being away for some days at a time, whilst he found very specific things to use in his medicines. Very unusual plants that can only ever be found in certain places. Because he was a quote-unquote healer and a kind man, nature seemed to embrace him, allowing him to discover and take such things, as if it knew he was only using them for good. He always came back from his missions happy and with the required items, having felt safe during his travels. He was a very solemn and wise man, except for when he was healing somebody. Then, his smile brought joy to the entire community. But something happened on the last mission. Something caused him to return to the tribe empty-handed, without the much-needed ingredients to help the poor family and child who were suffering. He returned home with much sought, instead of sharing stories with others, retreating to his home, refusing to leave and come out for days. When he finally did feel ready to share what had occurred on his quest, the people were all stunned. There had always been stories of skinwalkers, whispers around campfires, and warnings akin to the boogeyman under the bed. Although there was nobody in the tribe any longer who had witnessed such things. In the days when Malik was a child, there had been plenty of tales of those who could take on the form of another. This was usually an animal, and occurred either by wearing their skin on their pelt or strong enough. The person could possess another human, either controlling their mind or mimicking their body, hence walking in their skin, Skinwalker. It was believed that this was bad magic, that only those who had committed the worst kind of crimes and atrocities were able to do such things, and that the acts were only performed with nefarious intention. Malik had told the family that it would take several days to reach the exact spot, the plant that he needed. Now, he finally felt able to share with them why he had returned, without the much-needed plant root to help their son. When he had first spotted the deer, he never for one moment imagined that it seemed to be following him. It was hardly unusual to see wildlife, since his quest took him deep into the forests or mountains, and the animals usually paid him no mind. Again, just seeming to accept he was there for good reasons, and to help people. It wasn't like some Disney movie with all the animals racing over to him. But they weren't bothered by him either. He'd seen the creature a day after he began his travels. He took notice of this particular deer just because of the unique-looking pattern on its hide and strange piercing eyes. Eyes that did not appear quite right, although he could not think of a good reason why that would be so. He didn't approach the animal, as he did wonder if it might be diseased somehow, and that was affecting the eyes. Although not afraid, it was only a deer after all. Malik still felt some trepidation, and then he saw it again. The exact same deer, since he'd recognized those markings and strange, not right eyes anywhere. Only, it was now over a day later, and he had spent much of the time moving. This seemed to be an impossibility, and he was quite rightly spooked by the incident, yet carried on. It was not yet enough to send him home without the thing he was searching for. By the fourth day, he had almost forgotten about the strange, coincidental encounter, until he saw it again. This time, he knew it was no accident. The creature was following, tracking him, and there's no way that this could just be a regular deer. And in that moment, Malik understood what was following him. He looked into the eyes of this deer, searching for recognition. When it came, He nodded, showing that he knew what he had to do. And he turned right around and traveled back to the village, arriving for the first time since he had taken up his post, empty-handed. The family, although sad and confused, understood why Malik did it. They knew they may not always know the reasons behind certain actions, and that they should trust this wise man. They asked if he would tell them who the Skinwalker was, as he had indicated in his recount that there had to have been a sense of recognition when he looked into the eyes of the steer. Malik had shaken his head and said no. He had indeed recognized that the eyes were strange because they were human, and human eyes do not belong to an animal. The family had accepted this, as the medicine man had never lied to them before, or gave them any reason to distrust him. However, they knew he was holding something back. They just didn't know what or why. Malik knew they wouldn't ponder for too long, that although disappointed, they would accept what had happened. Perhaps even try some traditional remedy bought from a store or prescribed by a doctor. It was far better that they didn't know that he had of course recognized those eyes, and upon arriving back, had popped round to the great-grandmother of the boy who was having trouble sleeping and night terrors. Whilst declining a cup of tea, he had taken his seat on the porch for a few moments as they briefly spoke about the weather and admired the deerskin pelt with the unusual, unique pattern on the rocker. This is a story that's always been passed down from my family, from my tribe. I hope you enjoyed it. It's one thing that we've always suspected. The grandmother had been a long-term witch, and she had cursed the boy in the family for outcasting the grandmother earlier on in life. Now, as far as specifics, like was this a generational curse? Did anything ever become of the grandmother? I don't know, but it's a story I thought you'd be interested in hearing. I'd be happy to dig in deeper and see if I can find more tribal stories that have been passed down. Anyway, thank you so much and enjoy this story while I can supply it. I'd like to tell you about an encounter I had with the cryptid. I'm not sure what it was, but it looked nothing like anything I'd ever seen before, especially since this was in the Utah desert. You often hear crazy stuff happening in the middle of nowhere, when there are never any witnesses about, until I saw this thing. That was exactly what I thought it was. Crazy, but it's real. Now, of course, being in the middle of the desert, there are plenty of animals about and a whole lot of you have to be real careful of. Always wear your boots, and you never know what you might step on or what you might have to run from. See, I was on a long-haul delivery route, which was going to take a few days, but it was something I was used to doing. And sometimes, the lengthy, lonesome stretches of road beat getting stuck in downtown city traffic when you got a deadline. I like to look out of the truck windows as I'm cruising down those long stretches of nothing and see what might be about. It tends to be late at night that you'd spot the more nocturnal creatures coming out when they assume the place to be safer. The rig I drive is well lit, and I always have some headlights on and use the horn. There might not be any other traffic, but I don't want to hit anything with this speed truck. I know some truck drivers will actually keep count of all the roadkill they've caused, but, that's not me. Look, I've seen all sorts of critters out there. I've also seen a lot of beauty, and then I saw something like I'd never come across before, nor would I ever hope to again. At first, I thought it was just a regular coyote. A big fella, but very much just an animal. He seemed to want to run alongside the truck, beside his fine. I actually thought it was kind of cute, just so long as it didn't try to outrun me or run in front of me. Then he would have been a very flat coyote. Anyway, it was just following along, and I wasn't really paying much attention, but suddenly, it dawned on me that he'd been there for some time. I reckon a good 15 minutes, and I wasn't exactly crawling along. So I looked down at my buddy, and well, it actually gives me goosebumps to even type this. But I swear, he grinned up at me. There was this word I remembered from high school English, personification, which means giving human attributes to inanimate objects, or things that should not have human attributes. Well, this might have been an animal rather than a thing, but that was no animal-like expression. It was human. It was enough to freak me the hell out, and I put my foot to the floor to haul out of there and leave that weird grinning creature for the dust. But you know what? It didn't leave. I watched the speedometer go higher and higher, so I was almost at full speed the rig could travel, and it was still there, not seeming to be remotely worried about how it shouldn't naturally be able to do that. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I was scared now. There was no way any creature could maintain that speed. I was beginning to think it might follow me all the way to my next scheduled stop, when all of a sudden, it began to slow down. I started to feel some relief, thinking it must have finally tried out and that I was safe enough to make sure I looked into the mirror. That was when I saw the thing that scared me even more than the coyote, being able to match the speed of the truck. This thing had gone, completely disappeared. But there was a person standing on the side of the road, lit up and illuminated by my taillights. That person was holding what appeared to be, in my faint vision, an old fur coat or pelt. Did I slam on the brakes and make sure that person was okay? Or did I scream and carry on way past my designated stop until daylight? Well, I think you can guess. And obviously with the truck, I couldn't slam on my brakes. That's not how semis work. So I guess, had no choice but to keep going. But I want to ask you, what could that thing have been, or who? How did something that was obviously a large but regular coyote start with turn into something that grinned like the devil, was as fast as a speeding truck, and then turned into an actual person holding fur? I've heard tales of skinwalkers, but I don't know. I know it sounds completely impossible, and the first thing my girlfriend said when I told her was that I must have been driving for too long, and possibly I imagined it, that I maybe fell asleep and dreamt it. But I know it was real, and to be honest, I'm not sure what it would have happened if I had stopped. It was just wrong. I could feel it was wrong. I hope to God I never see anything like that again. That was too much. I work as a ranger, and as you can imagine, we happen upon some very strange things from time to time. All sorts of things that I could tell you about. Things that members of the public would never believe. Things that I would have never believed without having seen them firsthand for my very self. One of those things is when we found a whole load of dead animals with no obvious injuries whatsoever. Upon closer inspection, we happened to come across 2 tiny puncture wounds on their bodies, but in random places. Sometimes the neck, but often the leg, stomach, anywhere really. And cause of death was always full and total loss of blood. The bodies were dry husks. We're not just talking small creatures either. We found deer, doe and bucks, moose, even black bear. We didn't have a clue what on earth could possibly be responsible. One of my colleagues threw the idea of a vampire, but he was rightfully laughed at. We didn't have a clue what on earth could possibly be responsible. So we ended up having a stakeout, trying to capture what was causing all of this devastation. We set up nighttime cameras, and a few of us made the decision to stay out too. At this point, we were more interested than frightened, and also, we wanted to know what was doing this. Around midnight, we heard a noise. We were all hunkered down, just waiting to see what, if anything, might come. But of course, the woods in the evening isn't exactly quiet, so we were just waiting to see what was causing the attacks. We were looking at the monitor, which was showing us the screen from the infrared cameras. We didn't want to get too close to where we thought the action was taking place, as whatever predator it was would be able to smell us and likely not appear. Well, something did show up on camera, but we have no idea what it was. It was large, a strong and sturdy mass by the look of it, appeared to have dark skin or fur, and was able to overpower the deer without any problems. We hadn't set any sort of elaborate trap, as to be honest. We weren't even sure if it was going to show, and if it did, where it would be. But we did have guns and a flare which we now shot up into the sky as a warning. It didn't react at all to the flare, so we shot off a couple more rounds, more to scare it off than anything. This it didn't seem to like, and it raced off. There were 3 of us watching this. 2 of us were veterans at this game, but we had a rookie with us too. The other and I were more than happy to observe. We didn't want to go chasing after this thing when we probably weren't prepared to protect ourselves. Whatever that creature was, it was easily able to overpower and drain large animals of their blood. If it could take down an adult moose, why not a person? However, the rookie must have gotten it into his head that he wanted to be some kind of hero as he charged off in the direction of the beast. Thankfully, whatever it was now long gone. Even with a firearm, I wouldn't have hedged any bets on who would win. And do you know what? It never came again. Whether it knew it had been spotted or not, or whether it sensed us there, we'll never know. But we never had another unexplained death. No more random puncture wounds, and certainly no more draining of blood. It'll be a mystery that we will never solve. My parents were high school sweethearts, living in Arizona at the time. Sometimes they would go horseback riding together, far out into the desert. They ended up buying a ranch too. But before all of that, they had a really messed up and traumatic experience. Just after they had gotten married, they decided to head out into the desert for a couple of days and camp out overnight. They each rode a horse and took a tent and supplies. They were used to this kind of thing and knew how to be safe, what to look out for, the best place to hitch up the horses, where there was shade and water, etc. At some point during the night, there was a tragedy, something which to this day they still remember and cannot explain. You see, when they woke up the next morning, one of the horses was dead, flat on the ground, no visible injuries whatsoever, but very much so dead. The other horse was just standing next to it, as if it didn't even notice or care. It was very unusual, since horses are generally very sensitive creatures. Both my parents are very light sleepers. My mom often ends up on the couch when Dad snores too loud. There was absolutely no way they would sleep through the noise of one of the horses being attacked. They were distraught, to say the least. It was my mother's horse and horse's neck. She noticed something. 2 little holes, which were barely visible, but definitely there now that she had seen them. They were deep, not just surface wounds, almost like something had drilled into the horse, or latched onto it. There was the smallest drops of blood. My mother refused to leave her old friend, so my dad ended up riding his horse home, then driving his truck and trailer out to collect Mother and hers. They asked one of their buddies, who was some sort of medical examiner, to see what could have caused the unusual wound and way of death. They were at this point, thinking that some sort of poisonous snake had bitten the horse, and it somehow had a heart attack, even though there was none of the usual signs like vomiting or frothing around the mouth. Well, it wasn't that. When their buddy performed the autopsy, he ended up calling in another colleague, as he was totally stumped by what he had discovered. He asked my parents, "Are you sure there wasn't any blood at the scene?" And they replied, "Nothing, not a drop." It would have been easy to spot, because you see, when the guy opened up the horse, it was completely dry inside. Not one single drop of blood was left, as if it had all been leaked out. When examining the wound on the neck, they discovered it was a clean puncture wound. Very well done. The only possible explanation of death was that something had latched onto the horse, somehow, without making a single noise or kicking up a fuss, and completely drained it of every last drop of blood. All the while, the second horse just watched, not being spooked or fussing. All done in total silence. Otherwise, one of my parents would have actually awoken. This story made the local newspaper. People began locking their animals up at night, keeping a closer eye on them. A couple even set up guard on their barns, armed with shotguns. Meanwhile, others began hanging crosses in their yards, or even burning sage. Rumors were rife, and one name kept coming up over and over, although my parents swore they never took much notice. Chupacabra. Was it really the blood-sucking mythical beast? From what I have read, it usually prefers goats, but hey, how do we know whether even cryptids can pass on a free meal when they just so happen to be passing through? I'm not saying I believe one way or the other, really, but it was the right area and right sort of time. What else could have caused that sort of injury and cause of death and leave absolutely zero trace? I had a really weird and pretty scary experience the other night. I was out, walking with my dog, and we were heading back from quite a long walk. I was feeling pretty worn out, and my dog was beginning to trail behind me. All I could think was putting my head down into my pillow. We live in quite a rural place, and there is a lot of space in between the houses. Several of my neighbors also have livestock, mainly chickens, a couple of pigs, that sort of thing. It was when I was walking past my closest neighbor, who just so happens to have 3 large pigs, that I heard a screaming, squealing noise. My dog began going mad, barking, trying to get off his leash. Mr. Jones in that house is old and deaf, and would likely sleep right through it, even if a coyote or something was attacking his precious pigs. He loved those pigs, more than any person. Grabbing the leash tighter, I headed into the yard, thought I would be a good neighbor and go check on his pigs. I knew he wouldn't mind me being on his property, or so I hoped. I was just trying to be a good Samaritan. But I didn't want to spook the pigs anymore, so I tied the dog to a post and headed carefully over to the pen. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure exactly what I was expecting to see. It was pretty dark, of course, as it was around 1 in the morning. Listen, I work swing shifts, so my schedule is literally all over the place. So I try and get exercise and walks in when I can. But Mr. Jones keeps a porch light on, which was giving just enough illumination to the pen that I could roughly make out what was happening. Something was in there with them. I'm not a fool. I'd be out walking my dog, and I didn't have any sort of weapon on me. I backed away real slow, took the dog off his leash. I no longer cared about spooking the pigs. Here is a big dog, and my hope was that he would scare off whatever was in there. I didn't know exactly what it was. It looked kind of like the size and shape of a coyote, but it didn't look right. I told myself it was just fright. I was scared, and the fact that the pig pen was in shadows. Well, my dog leapt in and began attacking whatever this animal was. About a minute later, gave a yelp that almost stopped my heart in place. The thing, which was certainly not a coyote, jumped over the fence of the pen and raced off towards the woods at the back of his property, on 2 legs. I didn't get a great look at it. I jumped into the pen, and as my dog was lying on his side, whimpering and dying, there was blood pouring out of his neck. I checked on the pigs. All 3 were dead. They looked like they had just fallen over and died. I wrapped my dog's neck in my sweater and banged on Mr. Jones's door. I didn't want to stay. I wanted to get home and make sure my dog was okay, but I had to tell him what had happened. The next morning, I went back to see him, and thankfully, the injury to my dog had been superficial, and after a quick trip to the ER animal doctor, he was patched up. The vet was a bit baffled as to that animal, since I told them about the attack, what could have caused the injury, as he said it was a very specific wound, 2 puncture marks. Mr. Jones, however, was devastated. The sheriff was called, and it was reported. When the sheriff came to see him and take a look at the pigs, he was just as baffled as the vet had been. They ended up asking the same animal doctor that I told you it was a small rural town about the cause of the death. The only injury he could find was 2 puncture marks on each of their necks. Cause of death, blood loss. Not a drop of blood left in anything. What did I see that night? Was this a person puncturing the neck holes? Was this some sort of wild dog that had the ability to walk upright? But what on earth sucks the blood out of animals like this? Is it true that vampires can be a thing? Or are there vampiric animals? Please, help me understand this. I am just trying to make sense of it all, and I honestly can't. So, I have to preface this story with admitting that I had been drinking when it happened. However, we were talking a few beers, down with my local friends. I wasn't wasted, just a nice warm buzz. Best to be honest. It happened a few years ago, now. Oh, and before I continue, I have never met any drinker in my entire life or known anybody that has seen things off of a few beers. I feel like that's important to note when I tell this story and people say, yeah, but you drank, or yeah, but you were buzzed. Again, alcohol, at least in that small of quantity, does not cause hallucinations. Not like this. As I said, I'd been down at the bar, and we had been chit-chatting and having a good time. Once it got to closing time, we all headed off our own way. For me, it was about a half-hour walk home from me, which I never minded. The fresh air was always clearing and invigorating. I have walked that route 100 times, day and night. And at the time, it was sometime in November, before Thanksgiving. I can recall it being very dark and cold, and I was walking pretty quickly. I do live in a little busy town, though, so there were streetlights most of the way, cars going past. It wasn't dead, even though it was roughly 11:30 p.m. So not early, but not in the early hours in the morning. But halfway through my walk, there is also an underpass under one of the main roads. They're never pleasant places. You don't want to hang around them. Not because I thought anything bad might happen, but they stink. Lots of trash. There might be a homeless camp nearby, I'm not sure. But I do know sometimes you get homeless people. They never give me any problems, and I feel bad for them. but they usually bring down a lot of bad things: drugs, trash, drug deals, gangs, etc. It's a case of head down, hands in pockets, breathe through your mouth, and get out of there as soon as possible. The road above it is fairly large, and the pass is quite long, and of course several of the lights in there are always broken or seem to be flickering. Even in the middle of the day, it can be a bit spooky. So, it was typical that when I was walking through right, then less than half of the lights seemed to be on one, and the ones that were flicking on and off, like some lame laser show. I was less than halfway in when they all went out together, just for a moment or two. I stopped still as they began to flicker again towards the other end of the pass, the end I needed to get to in order to exit. And standing there was the single most terrifying thing I've ever laid my eyes on. At first, I thought it was a person, because what else would be standing there, tall and upright, on two legs? A person, right? What I'm about to tell you now is going to sound very cliché, but the tunnels seem to get really cold. Yes, I have already said it was November, and nighttime, but the air went from chilly to absolute frigid. I could just sense that gut feeling, that instinctual, that something was really off about this person. But I had no choice. I had to keep moving, and the only way I was going to get home was to pass him or them. As I got closer, the more weird I felt. My entire being was screaming, "Run away." And to be honest, as I said, although I was no means drunk, I think the alcohol in my system kept me moving and not running back in fear. They don't call it Dutch courage for nothing. Just as I was close enough to be able to make out this blurry and shadowy feature, the end light above him flashed on, and I got to see exactly what was in the underpass with me. He did look like a person. So far, he was human-shaped. I know that sounds weird, but let me explain. The first thing I noticed was that he was naked, and had almost white, pale, translucent-like skin. Hairless, very skinny, almost sickly. Think like a Holocaust survivor, on the verge of death, bones protruding out from under their skin. They looked visibly starved, as if seeing a pale, naked bloke in the tunnel in the middle of the night wasn't traumatic enough. Then what I will describe now will tell you why this was so bad. His face wasn't right. He, or they, or whatever it was, had tiny little black eyes, virtually no nose, and a wide, gaping mouth that appeared to have sharp little teeth like a shark, and two overly sized, protruding canines. That's right, canines, as in fangs, and his face was dried blood all over it, like there was some coming out of his mouth. And I could tell you, I stood there, gaping at him. I can tell you, I just stood there, gawking at him or it. I'm not sure now I could call this thing a him. I just don't know. Then, just as I actually began murmuring some sort of prayer, I thought it was going to kill me. But it sort of just flew away. I know it sounds weird, but honestly, just like in a movie or something, it shot straight up into the air and appeared to dissipate or vanish entirely. I ran out of there as fast as I could, all the way home, like my life depended on it, and it really did feel that way. What was that thing? I keep going through all sorts of ideas. I know some drugs can really mess you up, but as far as I know, they don't give you the ability to fly. As I said, it was a few years ago now. I can tell you that I never went near that underpass again. If I met my friends, I'd just get a taxi or an Uber home, not even bother walking. Not even in the daylight, unless I couldn't help it. I've looked through newspapers, online articles, anything, but I've never come across anyone seeing remotely similar to this. Or maybe they have, and like me, have just been too scared to talk about it, through fear of ridicule, or fear of being called a liar. Either way, I know that I will never forget that night, and that thing I saw, I hope I never see it again. I wouldn't call myself an urban explorer. I would just call myself somebody whose curiosity gets the better of him when he sees places that look like they've been abandoned for a very long time. I don't take all the pictures, I don't make the videos, and I don't run the YouTube channel. I just see a dark hole, and some part of me decides that I can't go on with life unless I see what's in there. It amazes me how people go through their daily lives and don't notice the empty, dark places that surround them. It's like they just take it for granted that there's no empty unused space around them, when actually, such places are close enough that at any given time for them to breathe on. I take the subway to work every day. Just about everybody around me has their nose buried in a book or glued to their phones. But I have a way of looking around, because there's bound to be a part of the subway that's no longer in use and that's waiting to be explored. There was one such place that I've been working up the courage for months to check out. I noticed it within 2 or 3 weeks of taking this new job, which required that I take the subway. You would miss it if you blinked. I couldn't tell if it was a hole in the wall or a door in the wall that just wasn't maintained. Either way, it was in a section of the tunnel that was supposed to have been off limits to pedestrians, which for me was a big, flashing red arrow. I eventually decided on a day that I was going to check it out. I packed a bag and made sure I had a couple of functioning lights, got the schedule of the train down so that I wouldn't get squished, and then I went. The walk to the hole in the wall was a bit longer than I had estimated. I likely misjudged how quickly I was traveling when I was in the subway car. The adrenaline rush from wondering if I was going to make it in time without getting run over was oddly enjoyable, but looking back, it's not something I would want to do again. I'm happy to say that I reached my destination without incident. The only thing that happened was my heartbeat picking up from sheer excitement. There was indeed a door, but it looked like it had been torn off its hinges at one point in time, and half-heartedly put back in place. I didn't need a fraction of the tools that I thought I would. The door put up as much as a fight as a dead body. Shining my torch around, the first room I found myself in appeared to be some sort of office space. Desks and swivel chairs were glazed with dust. Nothing smelled out of the ordinary, besides the mustiness and stillness of age. The furniture having a slightly dated look to it. So, I made a mental note to keep an eye out for a calendar that maybe had been left behind. I was hooked. The place was mine, and I was going to uncover its secrets. The other rooms were similar. There didn't appear to be any accommodations for visitors. No lounges or anything where people would sit around reading magazines. I uncovered at least 11 rooms, and I was beginning to wonder if I would get lost. What I had found was turning out to be rather vast. Even with all these rooms, there was no papers left behind, no calendars, which was as inspiring as it was disheartening. It suggested to me that they were trying to hide something sensitive. And then, I went into one of the more rooms that was behind a heavy door, heavy enough to take care of a freezer. That's when the smell had hit me. Something had been rotting down there, and recently. Perhaps a rat or something. I tried to tell myself, but shining my light around revealed carcasses of wild animals, arranged in neat stacks. foxes, squirrels, raccoons, feral dogs, cats, and even rats. I think I even saw something big enough to be a dog or a coyote. Some detail about the bodies was trying to reach me through my senses. I had to stare before I could finally put my finger on it. Each carcass had 2 neatly spaced punctures in it. Also, the carcasses that had clearly been there a while seemed to be well preserved, as if they had somehow been embalmed, which would mean that the blood had been drained out of them. That's when I felt my throat tighten. My senses ramped up, and my imagination threatened to conjure up perceptions where there was nothing to see or hear. I began to think that I could hear something matching my footsteps. There hadn't been an echo before, and then there was when I had discovered the stash of partially mummified animals. When I direct my light to where I thought I could hear the mimic, there was nothing. I decided to walk out there and not look back or stop for anything. That's when something behind me lunged and missed. When I got my light on it, I thought I was looking at a very scrawny, naked child. It was thin as bodies you saw in the photos of mass burials during World War II. Then, it turned its head toward me. It had a canine cast to its features, yet it appeared to be pink and bald. Its mouth hung open, showing 2 rather long canine teeth, a very long tongue, and an organ clearly in the habit of lapping. I realized that I had brought nothing with me to properly defend myself, so I tried to keep my light on it and back out of the abandoned cluster of rooms. The face it kept trained on me looked fearful, but it advanced on me with each step I took backwards. I wasn't afraid of me at all. It made soft hisses, followed by muffled clicks in its throat. Just as I had thought I might have cornered myself by not looking where I was going, I found the aperture back out into the subway. Checking the time was an afterthought. My only concern was getting away from the subway. It came right up to the doorway, but it seemed to flinch at the light. I made it back out without getting run over or bitten. That's probably one of the most horrific urban exploration stories I can share with you. I've been single since I was 16. I'm 37. I can't go around sharing my story with the public because it technically involves an unsolved case. In this day and age, any publicity can be turned around and made somehow into incriminating evidence. It's just something that I've been carrying around for a long time, and I need to tell somebody, even if nobody knows who I am. I'm hoping that telling it to you guys and your listeners, by extension, will help me to lay this to rest. I fell in love when I was 15. I think everybody knows just how white-hot teenage love burns. It may be shallow, but it's still intense. We both lived in a backwater township in Michigan. One of those places where you have a huge forest and 6 houses, just close enough to each other that somebody eventually decides that constitutes a town. We had been neighbors there all of our lives, and didn't even know it until middle school. We both couldn't look away when we first saw each other. Both of us spent our share of time outdoors, so it was only a matter of time, of course, that we would find ways of spending time together outside the classroom, without anyone suspecting it. Despite growing up all around those woods, there were certain parts of it that made me feel apprehensive. But this girl, she was fearless. She drove straight into thorns and poison ivy, and stuff that looked like coyotes slept in it, and she never got hurt or anything. I tried to charm her as a good old country boy, then came to find out she was more rugged and at home in the outdoors than I was. It was as endearing as it was embarrassing. I told her that we needed a spot where nobody would ever interrupt us when we were together. So, she took my hand and guided me to a corner of the woods that made the outside world feel 1,000,000 miles away. Almost a whole other world away. But it was near enough to have the rickety remains of one of those old-timey corn cribs. She had outfitted it just enough for us to be comfortable. It looked like a condemned structure from the outside, but cozy enough in. We had an oil lantern in case we got caught in the dark. Like all teenage relationships, there were rough spots. Some worse than others, but we got through most of them, all but one. And it was the one that cost me the most. I only had the backbone to go out to our special spot when she was with me. I just couldn't do it by myself. I felt like there were things in the thickets and the shadows, just waiting to get me by myself. She was in and out of there, all the time by herself, but I just didn't have it in me. Our parents were beginning to get suspicious, and to that, the fact that she thought I had my eye on someone else. She wouldn't let me explain my side of things in detail that I thought was necessary. So, we ended up arguing really bad and went our separate ways. She was not at school the next day, or the day after. The weekend came, and I spied on her house. I saw her parents, and I saw her little brother, but I did not see her. I wondered if she was camping out at our special spot. I'm ashamed to say that I was too much of a coward to make a walk out to it by myself. I wanted to, but no matter how I put my mind to it, I couldn't shake the feeling of some kind of presence in those woods, watching me the way I watched her house. I let Saturday and Sunday go with her, still missing. Of course, by then, the alarm had been sounded that there was a teenager who was unaccounted for. It wasn't safe for me to spy on her house anymore, and the whole thing hit the news. By Tuesday, I had worked up the bravery to go out to our special spot and see if anything had become of her there. She was there, and she was dead. I had hoped that she was just asleep, but nobody sleeps with their eyes open by that much. There was a notepad nearby. She had been writing me a letter when something interrupted her. It was a letter to me, and the page was only half full, and it ended in the middle of a sentence. There were no bruises, only 2 holes cleanly punched into her neck. Her skin was even gray and devoid of color. I got home, called the cops, told them what I had found. That was the day that my faith in humanity came to a screeching halt. I never dreamed that so many people would want me to be the bad guy. Not just her parents, but the rest of the town. The rest of the viewing area. Minds were made up that I was the one that had killed her. I must have done it in a fit of jealousy when I saw the note she was writing. When I made my defense with the strange injuries found on her neck, people acted like I was speaking in Latin or something. It just didn't register. Their anger made them deaf to anything that wasn't a confession of guilt. Just enough detectives and legal eagles had just enough brain cells to comprehend the fact that I wasn't responsible for her death, and I was ruled out as the killer. But the judge's verdict wasn't good enough for everyone else. I was all but completely ostracized. I'm pretty much a hermit now. I have been ever since that I could afford to live on my own. People are like unpredictable dogs. Yes, I've gone back to our special spot. I've done so many times over the years. A few times, I did it to offer myself to whatever had killed her, or whoever, to leave behind my body to the community. Then, I started getting the idea that I would kill the thing that killed her and present it to either law enforcement or possibly the Smithsonian's, depending on what I find. I've come close to bagging it a few times, and it's definitely not human. I don't think it has the mental capacity to understand what it has done to my life and my psychiatric health. That doesn't change the fact that I'm going to kill it. That's my reason for living right now, killing this thing. When I'm not drinking long enough to get myself together and go out there, I try to figure more about the thing. I'll get my way eventually. After that, I don't know what I'll live for. This was before you weren't allowed to smoke in bars anymore. I was at my favorite beer hole, where the smoke was thick enough to drive a nail into it. I was just beginning to get a real good buzz when my younger brother started blowing up my phone. His speech was so rushed that I was afraid that he had gotten back on the meth again. Turned out he was just super excited over something. All I could piece together was that I needed to come to his place as soon as possible. I was caught. I didn't dare tell him that I went out drinking without him. I couldn't dream up anything more important to keep me from going, so I paid up my tab and left. The trees and the telephone lines were black cutouts against the setting sun by the time I pulled into his driveway, and he was waiting outside for me, running in circles like a dog that needed to go real bad. I asked him what was so important that I had to drop everything and come running right that second. He gestured to me to follow him and didn't even stop to make sure I was following. He picked up an electric lantern and led me out to a small barn where he housed a hobby-sized crowd of goats. The goats were laying down, looking at us. I couldn't help but notice that they were looking nervous. My brother took me over to a couple of crates where a goat lay drawn out. I could hear the buzzing of a few flies, and I caught the whiff of death. My brother looked at me, as he was expecting some sort of reaction. Dead animals did not impress me, and I was starting to get creeped out by the eagerness that I saw in my brother's eyes. I asked him what this was all about. He told me to take a close look. I objected, on account of the fact that it was dead, and had been so long enough to clearly stink. He pointed to the animal's neck, held the lantern close in the goat's dark fur. I could see it. 2 holes evenly spaced, like something done by a large snake. I looked at my brother, who still looked like a maniac, about to peel out of a bank robbery. I asked him if he had found a giant anaconda or something. He shook his head, and he brought me over to another set of crates with a cage on top of it. My eyes still weren't completely adjusted, and I thought I had seen some kind of monkey behind those bars. But this monkey had no fur, had pale pink skin that was the same texture of the pleather on my steering wheel, and the eyes were wide open, coppery orange colored, and 2 long, hook-like canine teeth sticking out from the creature's lips. And then I saw those teeth, and it hit me. I waited for some hint that this entire thing was fake, but no. It blinked. It twitched. The skin around its shoulders and legs writhed as it was seized, with the instinct to flee, but could not. He must have been happy with the look that came onto my face. He tried to tell me it was something funny sounding, like a choopy-cooby or something. I'm not sure. He said that he had lost several goats to it, and wasn't sure what to make of it until that point. So he put a hen in a cage, and waited, and just like that, he bagged it. He proceeded to dance around like a fool, and that was something he did only when he was under the influence. I wouldn't find out much later that he indeed had been getting back on the meth, and beginning to abuse other stuff. He figured that with the money he was going to make from selling this thing to the proper people, he could afford that lifestyle. Well, when you dance around like that in close proximity, you tend to knock it over, and cages that get knocked over have a good chance of opening, and open cages tend to not hold whatever was inside of them, if you catch where I'm going. My brother knocked over the cage, and I saw the whole thing play out like it was in slow motion. The thing seemed surprised that it had a chance to get away, but I wasn't going to put my hands on it, and my brother's coordination was shot. It got away, just like that. Brother screwed up and paid for it. Nothing dramatic. Since he tested positive for all the garbage in his system, nobody believed a word of what he had to say, and I didn't see anything like that little green gremlin since. You're the only person that will ever hear me admit that, which is weird. And this is a story I've been keeping in, and I know by the way I write it that I probably sound like a storyteller, but this was my own personal experience. I've never in my life seen a creature that looked to be like that. It reminded me of some failed science experiment, something you'd hear about in a sci-fi movie, where they genetically splice things together to create a whole new being. Well, now that's a thing of the past, I hope. This happened directly to me. At the time of this story, I was a 12-year-old male who lived in California. For a summer trip, me and my family flew to Boise, Idaho, for a week to stay with my cousins. We stayed at their house for 2 days. Then came the best part. It was the best part. Until what happened, that is. On the third day, we drove to a small city in the Rocky Mountains of central Idaho. They owned a cabin in Ketchum. The first day was fishing at nearby lakes, playing games, and meeting a few of the neighbors on the small street. Everybody we met was nice. It was amazing. I thought nothing could go wrong. Before I say more, here's a layout of the area. The room where I slept was at the back of the house. There was no fencing at the back of the backyard, because it was on the bank of a freezing cold river. Directly on the other side of the river was a huge mountain covered by thick forest pine trees. A small path starts on the other side of the river, but there's no bridge. There is a 1/4 of a mile down the road in front of our house. I went to bed that night, woke up at 2 a.m., needing to use the bathroom. I got up and did my thing, and headed back to my room. As I got into bed, I felt so hot that I opened my window. Not 15 minutes after that I opened my window, I heard the most terrifying screech coming from the forest. It was raspy but high-pitched. I know for a fact it wasn't human. I've heard stories from horror narration YouTube channels that often describe creatures that make weird noises that sound sort of human, but aren't. I heard it once more, but this time closer. In the morning when I woke up, we explored around town. At 7 p.m., me, my sister, and my cousins got permission from our parents to go explore the forest. I was uneasy, considering I had heard creepy, human-like noises in the night, and it was nearing night. The oldest cousin, Alex, who was 16, took a loaded pistol, a lighter, and a backpack of snacks. I carried a hunting knife and a flashlight. The cousin my age, Julia, just took a flashlight. My sister, Brianna, and the other cousin, Karina, who were 10, took some extra batteries and a small bag of candy each. We made our way across the bridge at the end of the street and back to the path on the side of the river, across from the house. All of us began the hike to the top of the mountain. We made it to the top of Bald Mountain in an hour and a half. The view from 9,000 feet was incredible. At 8:55, Alex and I figured it was time to head down and order the group to the path. At this point, it was dark now. The sun had fully set. Julia and I turned on our flashlights and shined them ahead as we walked. Some halfway down the mountain, which was about 45 minutes into the walk, I got the dreadful feeling you get when you're being watched and followed. Seconds later, something that was hiding in the bushes a few yards into the tree line that bordered the path ran off on our right. I brushed it off as some type of small animal. About 5 minutes after the incident, what we heard made me tingle with fear, and my heart dropped to my stomach. That same horrifying screech from last night echoed all through the forest, a mile or two away. I told everybody we needed to move faster, and we did. It went off again, but closer. Again, closer. Whatever that thing was, it was moving faster than us. We were full-on speed walking by then. That still wasn't fast enough, because soon the screeching stopped, and we heard loud steps 30 yards off to the right. I got that feeling of being watched. Alex took his gun, firing 2 shots in the general direction of the steps. The creature backed off, even though we thought he was gone. I still sensed we were being watched. As the river came into sight, it caught me and everyone else by surprise. I heard the path gravel crunching behind us. I looked back, and in the darkness, saw the outline of something that resembled a human on the path behind us, with about 200 yards of distance between us. I told Alex, and his face went pale when he looked. We told the rest of the group quietly, and on 3, we all broke out into a run towards the river. Whatever that thing was, it was extremely fast. When we reached the river, there wasn't time to get to the bridge a quarter of a mile farther along the river, because this thing was catching up fast. We jumped in and swam across the ice-cold water. It got to the river just as we made it up the bank and into the backyard. Julia and I shined our flashlights and finally got a good look at what our pursuer looked like. It was a massive, hairy creature, standing about 7 feet tall. Huge, razor-sharp claws like a bear. Eyes that glowed red, that illuminated when a flashlight shined on them. Alex shot at it, and it darted off with one final long screech. We all looked at each other in pure terror, shock, and surprise. Alex explained everything to our parents. They didn't know what to make of it, and had never heard anything like it. I'm thankful nothing happened to us, and that I noticed the creature behind us. If I had not, one of the others might not have noticed until it was too late. The next time I stay at that cabin, I'm not going alone in those woods at night. Never again. Not after that. This thing was seen by me and my friends on 2 separate occasions. I will explain the first encounter. It is a decently long one, so bear with me. Me and my older brother and 2 friends decided that we were brave and ventured off into my pasture. Now, I'm not in a rural area where my neighbors are super far away. I'm only about 20 minutes from town. Well, the oldest in the group was 12. So being dumb, we walked out to the field. And keep in mind it was freshly diced and plowed, so there were no weeds. Armed with a pocket knife and a big knife and a CO2 airsoft gun, we walked out to my back gate and into the field. We saw nothing but the buildings maybe a mile in front of us. We also have coyotes out there. Well, we made it to the back of the field, and a horrible smell came out of the ditch, so we ran back. When we turned back to the field, we saw 2 figures. I know for sure that they were not there 25 minutes ago. Stupidly, we shot the gun at them, and they stood up on two legs. We panicked and ran inside and watched a movie. The second time is very quick. I was playing basketball late at night, and I saw this thing jump from tree to tree. I was older. It was 2 years from the last sighting, and I was strangely not scared. I just went into the house and went to bed. That is my story of the strange creature I saw those nights. If you know what it could have been, please tell me. It all started when summer came, and me and my 3 friends, Lola, Katie, and Jennifer, were all planning to go camping. We were all excited and scared at the same time, because we were going camping alone. Lola had asked her father if he could drop us off. He agreed to take us. When the next day came, we started heading up. Lola's dad set up the camper that we were using. There was some spare blankets inside. Lola's dad finally got us in his truck and turned around. He stopped, rolled down his window, and told us no boys. There were 3 rooms in the trailer, 1 master bedroom, and 2 rooms with each bunk. Each room had a TV in it, so nobody cared what room they got. Everyone knew that Jennifer did not like small rooms, so we let her have the big one. I was in a room with Lola, and Katie was in a room by herself. I started unpacking when we heard a loud boom outside. I asked Lola if she heard that. She asked me what, and she said she heard the boom. We both looked at each other, startled, then continued unpacking. But something seemed off. It was the fact that Lola was so chill about it. I was done unpacking, so I walked outside and started a fire. Jennifer walked out, asked if I saw it. I asked, saw what? And then she starts freaking me out. She was staring behind me, panicking, her eyes darting back and forth, and then calming. I felt as if something was watching me, so I turned around. I saw an orb in the corner of my eye, reddish black, but by the time I turned to look, it was gone. I was so freaked out. I told Katie she could cook instead. We had our family's secret recipe of shepherd's pie and a bunch of vanilla cupcakes. There were about a dozen cupcakes left in the open box, so we just left it on the table and went to bed. I could hear the TV coming from Katie's room, so I punched the wall and told her to be quiet. Right after I said it, everything went quiet, except for a small scream in the distance. It did not sound human. It gave me chills that ran down my spine. I dozed off, but woke in the middle of the night from hearing someone in the kitchen. I woke up Lola. Then we walked out into the small hallway that led into the kitchen. I saw Jennifer sitting on the table, staring straight ahead. Something touched me. I jumped and realized it was just Katie saying what was making those weird sounds. Jennifer was really creeping me out. She never stared into space this often. But then I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It was a shadowy figure. It was staring at Jennifer and slowly turned to face me and Katie. I froze. Katie froze. Jennifer then looked at us, as if being mind-controlled. Then the figure ran out the window, and Jennifer then dropped her head onto the table. We tried to wake her up, but ended up falling asleep. This experience still scares me, and is the only one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. Me and the others are still very close friends. We actually live together now. But we all remember that night, and whatever it was we saw. It turns out Jennifer remembers seeing it in the daytime, but was out cold when the rest of us saw it. It freaks us out even more, now knowing that our friend wasn't even awake and staring into space, eyes wide open. This story begins the day after I moved into my new house. I had just moved from my apartment, which was in a bad neighborhood, with lots of bad things happening there. But that's a whole other story. So, I had just moved into my new house, a small 2-bedroom house. The kitchen was right in front of the master bedroom, and the secondary bedroom was right off the living room. I had my mother and 2 siblings living with me. They took the very large master, while I took the secondary bedroom. Anyway, this encounter took place pretty late in the night, right around 11 p.m. Everybody had gone to sleep, so I was pretty excited that I got the house all to myself. I decided that I would do the dishes to help out my mother, then play some games on my Xbox for the rest of the night. I walked into the kitchen with my dog and started doing up the dishes. About halfway through them, I started feeling really uneasy. I started thinking that it was just an unexpected anxiety attack, which I get pretty often, so I didn't really think much of it. I paused, decided that maybe a glass of water would help. While I was sipping my water, I started to hear my dog growling from the living room. I say my dog, but he really is my mother's dog. He is a very, very good guard dog, as in will destroy an intruder in a heartbeat type of guard dog. So I hear him growling, a very low growl, a quiet growl. Me being the stupid 17-year-old who I am, I decided I was going to go see what he was doing. I put down my glass, walked into the living room, where both my puppy and mother's dog were standing by the front door, their nose in the crack of it. I tiptoed up my way to the door, listening very carefully. All I heard was a faint scratching noise. I assumed it was just a raccoon, or one of the stray cats that frequented our house, because we would always leave food for them. I took a peek out the front window, which is located right beside the door. Well, I didn't see anything. Just the dark yard and porch illuminated softly by the glow of the streetlight in the very front of the house. I told the dogs to chill out before they woke up the entire family. After they settled down a bit, I went back to finish up the dishes and think about what games I was going to play. As I was washing a plate, I got that uneasy feeling again. The feeling in the pit of your stomach that just feels like something is very wrong. I tried brushing it off, but it was coming on so strong. All of a sudden, I got the feeling as though somebody was behind me, staring at me, silently watching me. My uneasy feeling turned into scared, then stress. I was so uneasy that I whispered to myself, "Something bad is going to happen. I just know it." The floor began rumbling as though someone was running on it, running up behind me as my back was turned away from the entry to the kitchen. It rumbled so hard. The pounding of the footsteps was so loud. I didn't know what to do except put my hands over my ears to block out sound. It ran up behind me, and it slammed me into the kitchen counter, leaving a large purple bruise on my stomach. As soon as it all started, it stopped. Nothing but silence in the small kitchen. While checking my stomach, I waited, just to see if anything else was going to happen. But nothing did. The room fell quiet. I began panicking, feeling so scared about what had just happened. I finally got the courage to turn around, and as I did, I sighed in relief. My big-eyed pupper was sitting in the doorway, staring up at me. I walked over to her and hugged her, then hooked her up to a leash to take her out before I went to bed. At this point, it was about 12 p.m., and I was so scared and exhausted from that experience, I just decided it was the sleep my body was desperately craving but had not received, causing me to think something happened when it really did not. Though it doesn't explain the bruise forming on my stomach, I said to my pup,
Hard to believe that my mind could conjure up something so scary. She was hooked up, and when we walked out on the porch, normally we have 4 baby stray cats that basically live out there, but they were nowhere in sight. I assumed they took cover at the neighbor's house. I walked little Pupper into the yard, a little ways from the side of the house where the kitchen window was. Now, I wasn't in front of the kitchen window. I was at the front of the yard, but I could see the kitchen window from where I was standing. I looked down and talked to my pup, telling her what a good girl she is and how beautiful she looked. You know, what all puppy mamas do. She looked up at me and wagged her tail in delight. But then her mood suddenly changed as then her neck snapped to where the kitchen window was. When I say snapped, I mean she turned her head so fast, I for real thought she was going to break her neck. It startled me, so I naturally took a couple steps backwards, trying to calm down from the scare. I glanced over to where she was looking, just a small quick glance, and to my surprise, I actually saw something. I wasn't expecting to see anything, so I had a double take at the sight of this thing. We both sat and stared, trying to see what it was. It looked like a tall black silhouette, maybe 8 feet tall, with a very large chest. I remember the chest so well, because it stuck out so far, like scarily far. The figure looked thin in the face, but quite large in the rest of the body. It was staring over the large hedge that was in front of our kitchen window. It was staring into the window, like it was waiting, silently, for somebody or something to move inside the house. I'm guessing my dog's eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, because she let out a small woof at this creature. As soon as she did this, the creature turned his head and stared at me with huge green eyes. My heart sank. The way its eyes were reflecting the light made me instantly think that what I was standing in front of was a giant 7 to 8 foot tall animal. It was silent. No sound. No nothing. In fact, I was so focused on the creature that I had failed to realize that the night insects had gone silent. There was no noise, except for the static sound of the energy coming from the city. I froze, while my puppy began barking loudly and violently. What could this be? Am I seeing things? Is this real? I scooped my pup in my arms, ran in the house. All the while, the same pounding and hearing the loud thudding footsteps as the previous encounter that took place an hour earlier. I ran so fast that I nearly tripped over my own feet. I darted indoors, basically tossing my pooch on the couch, locking the door as fast as I could, leaning against the door, and I listened for whatever it was that chased us in. I also held the door closed, thinking it would actually do something to protect us from that thing. All I could hear was the sound of my heavy breaths from running. My dog's barking must have disturbed my family, because my mother came out of her room, saw me holding the door closed. She saw that I was distressed, wrapped her arms around me, telling me everything was okay, and asking what happened. I couldn't get the story out. For some reason, my mind told me not to tell her, because I knew that she would not believe me. So, I made up a story about how one of the neighbors startled me and assured her that I was okay. To this day, she still does not know the story. None of my family does, and I still don't know what that creature was. But I do know one thing. It's going to haunt my mind for a very long time. The events I'm about to describe are very true, and I will take them to my grave. These events occurred around 2013 or 2014 midsummer in a small town in rural New Hampshire. Both stories also happened with one of my friend's friend, being present at the time, and he witnessed the same things that I did. The first event that took place was on a warm summer night. My friend and I live in the same town, only about 2 miles from each other. At the time, I had my license and he did not, so I would drive out to his house, hang out, play video games, or I would pick him up and drive back to my place to hang out. Right down the hill from us and my place is this old textile mill that has been closed for a while. There have always been rumors going around about how people died working in the mill years ago. Sometimes at night, if you look in the window, apparently, you can still see ghostly figures, still dressed in old-time clothing. Across the street from the mill is a dirt parking lot that telephone companies would park their work trucks in and grab them in the morning. I had just picked up my friend, and we were driving back to my house. As we were driving by the dirt parking lot, we noticed something. The telephone company trucks were big, and you could see underneath them on the other side of one of the trucks. I saw a pair of legs and feet, like someone was just standing there motionless. The legs were very pale, standing out in the darkness. There were no shoes, just bare feet. It kind of looked like they were the legs of a child around 8 years old. As we kept driving and passed the truck, the feet and legs disappeared. We were going fast that there was no way, if it was an actual person, they could have ran off before we passed them. I asked my friend if he saw that, thinking I was crazy. And he said, "You mean the white legs and feet?" he asked. To this day, I still hope it was our imagination, playing tricks on us. And sometimes I wonder if a child may have died working in the mill many years ago, back when child labor was legal. That story is just to establish that me and this same friend can confirm with each other that we're not crazy, and we did see something otherworldly. This last event happened to me and my same friend as the ghost legs. It was late at night, and I was driving him home after coming home from the movies. Let me remind you that I live in a very rural, woodsy town. We were on this stretch of road, close to his place with woods on either side, not driving very fast. The speed limit for that road is 20 miles an hour. Just remembering this next part as I write this chills me to the absolute bone. As we're driving along, this thing flies over the road, just above the tree line. It flew next to a streetlight, which lit the creature up pretty good. At first, I just thought it was some type of bird, but as more of it appeared by the light of the streetlight, I realized this thing was way too big to be a bird of any type. The thing we saw had the body roughly the shape and size of a large wolf, but with short fur. It had bat-like wings, big enough to support its weight and size. The creature had front and back legs, unlike a bird, and also had a tail. Luckily, I didn't see it long enough to get a good description of its head, and I'm glad. I was already completely paralyzed with fear. Later on, my friend claimed that it had red eyes. The whole time this was happening, my friend and I did not say a single word. The rest of the way to his house, we said nothing. When we finally pulled his driveway, I shut off the car, and we both began freaking out. I was hoping I was going crazy, and to this day, I would think I was, but somebody saw the exact creature I did. We went on inside and told his brother he thought we were crazy, and after that long while, we told nobody because who would believe us? To this day, I don't know what kind of creature we saw that night. Just thinking about going in the woods in that town now really scares me. If anyone has any idea what we might have seen, or any strange creature stories around the New England area, I would love to hear them. Thank you. I was so busy and preoccupied hiking out in the woods that day. I can't believe that I had the encounter that I did. Walking along the trail that I was on, it was a beautiful, serene sight, surrounded by tall redwoods on both sides, with a foresty expanse that seemed to go on forever. I had my backpack, my canteen, and nothing was going to stop me from the 6-mile trail loop. I had just gone through a really bad relationship, and I really needed some fresh air and some nature to kind of help cheer me up. The first thing I noticed, and I've gone on this trail before, is that it's usually quite busy, especially right around 10 a.m. People walking their dogs, other friendly hikers passing by, saying hello, waving, but it seemed kind of dead. This was a nice, beautiful morning in May. It should be booming, but I didn't think much of it. I just figured, hey, I have the trail all to myself. So I continued on at a good pace. There's a point in the trail where it kind of slopes down a bit, levels out, and then goes back up. So as I'm going down the slope, I hear noise off to my left, and I look, thinking somebody's in the woods. Maybe another hiker or somebody else walking their dog, potentially. And I look, nobody's there. I just immediately think it was probably a bird that landed or something. I mean, after all, these are the woods, and I can't put past any animals to be around. So I hardly even stopped, just kept on walking. But as I'm walking, I began to get this sensation that somebody is following me. So just like in the movies, I keep turning my head, expecting to hear leaves crunch or twigs to break, but nothing. In fact, the opposite happened. The forest that was alive around me, and birds, and the wind, and you can kind of just hear the forest. It was eerily silent, kind of like I walked into Silent Hill, just deathly quiet. I didn't notice this right away, but more noticed it after time, after I had reached the bottom of the slope. I was beginning to feel a little uncomfortable, but not totally afraid yet. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see somebody peering out behind a tree, watching me. But of course I saw nothing. I just thought nothing of it, and continued on my way, thinking that whatever was happening was very weird, but wasn't completely off-putting. At least, not just yet. So, I'm continuing my hike, and there becomes a large bend on the trail, and then it continues back straight. So I come around the bend, continue going on, and then there's a small little bridge, actually 2 small little bridges, that cross this small section of river. As I'm going across these bridges, I could have sworn to you, out of the right side of my eye, I saw a white face looking at me. So I turned to look, and I saw nothing. From what I saw out of the corner of my eye, it was an elongated face, and very hairy, but white. But when I turned, there was nothing there. So now I'm thinking, alright, this is getting weird. I feel like somebody is definitely trying to pull a prank. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to pick up the pace, finish this trail loop, and I'm done. So I picked up the pace even faster. And the further I went into this trail loop, which, by the way, still not seeing a soul around, things began to get even more creepy. It stayed completely silent this entire time, besides, of course, the sound of water and the river. And as I make it far enough away from the river, to where the sound of rushing water is barely audible, I began to hear something very large coming directly towards me, not just walking casually, but running. It sounded like a grizzly bear charging at me at full speed, and I'm looking around, surrounded by open forest and redwoods. If there was anything coming at me, with the sound that this thing had, you would see it, but I saw nothing, and I could hear it charging at me through the forest. Panic immediately set in, and I bolted as fast as I can. I'm no athletic runner. In fact, I probably couldn't even handle a marathon, but my adrenaline allowed me to run at least 1 to 2 miles straight. And yeah, my sides were killing me. Now, I was about halfway, probably a little over halfway into the trail loop, thinking that I had no other choice but to finish it out, since I was already here, and turning around now could mean sudden death. if what I was happening to deal with was hostile and dangerous. At this point in my trek, I did not feel safe. I was feeling hunted by something. Some large animal had me in for its dinner plate, and I did not want to be included. So I just walked a very fast pace after spending about 20 seconds trying to catch my breath. Fear drove me. Fear allowed me to push my physical limits and finish the trail loop in the amount of time that I've never done before. The entire time, deathly silent. Something around me. I could feel it. Something was not only following me, but watching me. And I never saw anything else besides that one face that I saw while crossing the river way back earlier on in the trail loop. However, as I got to the last mile of the loop, things really got out of hand. Not far off in the woods around me, and not to my left or right, but all around me. The forest came alive with these horrible growls and screams. It sounded like an animal getting hurt. Like, can you imagine the scream that a coyote, for example, would make if he got stuck in a bear trap? This howling scream of pain mixed that sound of pain with anger and deepened it quite a bit. And that's kind of what I heard all around me. There was multiple of whatever was making this. Now I knew for a fact there was some sort of animal following me, or animals, and I knew I had to quickly finish this trail loop, or else who knows what would have happened. The noises continued to go on and off, along with the rest of the forest being totally silent. After finishing the trail loop, nobody else was in the parking lot, which, again, incredibly weird and not normal. I made it to my car, the sound still completely silent, got in my car and I drove off. I've not been back to that trailhead since, and that was May of last year. I've posted my story online in a couple places, but haven't really gotten adequate feedback yet, or at least anything that would help me point in a concrete direction of what it could have been. Somebody had mentioned Bigfoot. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I do believe something happened. So maybe you can kind of help me understand what I went through, and maybe if there truly was some sort of unknown animal following me and stalking me. Hopefully, it did not plan to eat me. Not a monster sighting at all, but I saw something that I cannot explain what it was. When I was 17 and living with my father, he had a good amount of property and had a barn all the way up back. Beyond that is fencing, and for whatever reason, the old owners, before they put the fencing around the property line and the tree line, they had this kind of old, well, it wasn't a rundown shed at the time, but beyond the fencing into the wood line, there's this little maybe 10 by 10 shed, used for storing various tools and supplies. My father, for whatever reason, even after storing stuff in the barn and putting up fencing around the entire property, still insisted on putting supplies in there, when we had ample room in the barn. Why, I'm not exactly sure. So, my father always made me the fetch boy. Anytime he needed specific tools, even though he didn't use them that rarely, which is why I think he put them in there, he would have me go out past the barn, over the fencing, out about 30 or 40 meters into the woods, to the shed. It was completely out of the way, and there wasn't even a gate or anything. I had to climb over the fence, which was a small wooden fence, and then walk roughly 40 meters to get into the shed, which was padlocked, and would require a special key that my dad gave me. While it was a complete pain and inconvenience to walk all the way out there, it also gave me the creeps. I'm not gonna lie. You're surrounded by woods. Pretty dense woods, mind you. I always had the same feeling every time I was over in the shed grabbing stuff, that I was very vulnerable. That something, at any given moment, could reach out and grab me if it wanted to. I've never been a believer in monsters or Bigfoot, or anything that's a supposed hoax, but there's just something around that shed. I don't know. I can't put words to it. It made me very uncomfortable. And so every time my father would call me to fetch supplies from the shed, I would dread it. But I respect my father and I love him, so I did what I was supposed to do. He had purchased this entire plot of land when I was roughly 13 with his inheritance money. Shortly after that, when I was around 15, he really began trying to clean up the property. installing a nice fence, really using the barn, and keeping the shed all the way out back there for tools that he would only need for special occasions, keeping his main tools and his every now and then tools separated. That's enough background info. This was wintertime, and I remember because it had snowed. Not a heavy snowfall, but maybe a foot. Enough that there could be visible tracks in the snow. From me, leading out to the house, past the barn, up to the fence, climbing over the fence, and up to the shed. As I'm approaching the shed, it's completely silent, which isn't exactly uncommon in the wintertime. I unlock the shed, grab the few tools my dad needs, lock it back up, and I walk out, feeling incredibly creeped out. More so than usual. It felt like there was something around, but I tried to pay no attention to it and get back to my father, due to his poor patience. I did not want to make him mad. The day goes on, and my father requests that I go take the tools back and store them safely. So, it's now getting to be about evening time. The sun is just starting to set in the sky, so it's not dark or anything yet, but it will be soon. So I'm making my way back, and as I get to the fence, I could just sense deep down in my gut, something isn't right. Have you ever had that feeling? Or maybe you've been in a situation where your gut instinct is telling you, don't go further, don't do this, don't do that. Danger, imminent danger. That's immediately what I felt. And my first thought was, maybe there's a mama bear around with her cubs. Or maybe there's a cougar. You never know in these parts. Even more so considering all around me is very densely packed woods. And in the dead of winter time, without all the leaves, the brush was still thick, with bramble, dead bramble, trees, and everything else. Something could easily be hiding in there. But, not wanting to make my father angry, I decided to push my feelings aside and press on. These things needed to be put away, and he would be furious if I left his tools out for any reason. So I climbed over the fence, with the tools still in my hand, walked up to the shed. Now, as I'm walking up to the shed, I'm roughly maybe 10 meters. I hear something to my 2 o'clock come running at me through the woods. It sounded big. Imagine a silverback gorilla, or a rhinoceros, something of incredible size that is also bipedal, come charging at you. I'm in mid-stride, probably now about 5 meters from the shed, about to pull the key out of my pocket, when this thing breaks out of the brush, probably no more than 15 or 20 feet away from me. And this thing that I've never seen before in my life looks me directly in my eyes, and it looks pissed that I'm there. In that very moment, I felt my entire life flash before my eyes. I just knew I was a goner. Without even thinking, just reacting, I threw down the tools, turned around and ran, which I know is the worst thing you could possibly do, dealing with any unknown predator, because things like to give chase. I don't know if this thing ran after me. I just booked it, flying over the fence, and going as fast as I can, not checking if this thing ran behind me. My dad, who was outside the house, putting some of his stuff away, looked at me, and wondered what was wrong. Asked me why I was scared, since I probably wore it pretty well on my face, and I was stuttering really bad, telling him what I just saw. He immediately got angry, thought I was just trying to be lazy and not put away his stuff. He cut me off mid-sentence, demanding I go back there, finish the job that I was told to do, and put away things properly. He did not want to hear it, and in my teenage frustration, I felt desperate, not sure what to do. So I stood there for a moment, and I slowly walked back. You have to understand that in that moment, I really had no options. He was looking at me the entire time, making sure I go back and take care of the tools. But also, where he is on the side of the house that he's on, he can look and see the direction that I'm going, but he can't see beyond the fence. And once you cross over the fence, the woods are dense enough, even in winter, that you can't see the shed because of where it's tucked in at. I'm walking as slow as possible, dragging my feet, just anticipating this thing jumping out over the fence, going to grab me and kill me. I'm completely unarmed. I have nothing. Maybe a pocket knife in my back pocket. So I'm slowly making my way up to the fence, and just like before, it's completely quiet, void of any noise or sounds. I slowly climb over the fence, and make my way very slowly, trying to be as quiet as I can to the shed. I figured, in my moment of desperation, if I had the key pulled out, I could quickly walk up to the shed, being as quiet and stealthy as possible, grabbing the tools on the ground, which I could see, and quietly putting them in the shed, quietly locking it, turning and booking it out of there, and hopefully, whatever it is that I saw would not be around. Now, I begin my slow ascent towards the shed, Skyrim sneak style. I'm crouched, being as quiet and stealthy as I can, and as I get to about 10 meters from the shed, like I was before, I look over to where this thing barreled through the woods, and I could see all the snow that was disturbed from where it landed. And to my horror, I look, and I could see that once I had ran away, or who knows how long after, it escaped behind the shed. That's where the disturbed snow and tracks seem to lead, which means it's either hiding behind the shed, or it's in the woods close by. I was even more terrified now, my heart beating out of my throat, my hands sweaty. I quickly fumble the key, quickly grab the supplies off the ground, unlock the padlock, tear it off, open the door, and I don't even bother to gently set the tools in. I kind of just quietly toss them in. I'd figured my dad wouldn't notice, and I would just deal with it later. I quickly relock the padlock, and I turn around, and without wasting a second, I begin to run. But before I could even lift a leg to start running, I hear the nastiest, most guttural growl I've ever heard in my life. And it came from right behind the shed, right in the little patch of woods. I bolted out of there, jumping over the fence, and running back to my dad. I didn't even bother telling him anything. I just told him the tools are away and all is good. That was pretty much the end of that. The rest of the time that I lived there, I never experienced anything like that again, so I have no idea what it was I saw that day. But believe me when I say that I had to go back to that shed multiple times since then, including the following winter, and all the way up until I graduated high school, when I would turn 18, and I finally moved out of there to go live with some roommates in the city. Before I end this, I want to include more details on what this thing did and what it looked like. The first time, as I'm standing there, about 10 meters away from the shed, and this thing jumps out of the woods, onto the snow. It kind of just looks at me, looks angry that I saw it, but more kind of just staring me down. It was like a mixture of emotion on its face, a cross between sizing me up, angry that I was there, and like it was plotting or planning on what its next move was. It was terrifying looking, I'm not gonna lie. But after looking into its eyes, I knew that it was also highly intelligent, and this wasn't some wild animal. It had a massive, woolly, hairy body, covered in thick brown hair, legs just like a man. I couldn't see its feet or the bottom parts of its legs. It was buried in snow. It had really long, woolly, thick arms, massive hands like a person, with long, dangly claws, and its face was elongated, kind of like a dog, but it did not look canine at all. It had large fangs and teeth sticking out of its mouth, from its bottom jaw and its top jaw. It had sunken-in eyes that were set on the sides of its skull, and these long horns that would shoot from the top of its head, off in a kind of a spiraling direction. Not like a ram or goat, but they kind of angled off. They actually resembled that of gazelle horns, where they kind of angle up, but kind of twist and bend. They were also black. Whatever this monster was, looked like something straight out of my own nightmares, and was enough to make me frozen in the second. There was no thinking. It was fight or flight, do or die. And if I made the wrong choice, I could have died. I had no hesitations that this thing wouldn't kill me if it wanted to. I'm not sure why it jumped out at me, or if it heard me coming, or what. But it did seem to be surprised that I was there, like it wouldn't expect me to be there. And when it went behind the shed, maybe it was waiting for the right moment to attack me, or to lure me back there and eat me. I don't know. But as I told you, I never saw it again after that. That was the end of it. My father, of course, never believed me, even though I had told him and reiterated the story to him multiple times. He just still is convinced I was trying to be lazy and get out of putting the tools away, even though I've done a lot of work with my father, and never once have I acted like that. He's just a hard old fart, It's really driving me crazy that I can't find out exactly what I saw. It wasn't a Bigfoot, was certainly not a Dogman, and I don't think it was a Skinwalker. I tried to hop on Google Images and see if there's any creature that could come close to what I possibly saw, to maybe help identify a specific cryptid that would help narrow it down. Well, the closest I found was if you Google sheep squatch, and it's a creature that looks similar to what I saw. Not at all the same though. If you Google it, you'll find a creature that has ram-like horns, a very sunken-in face with a lot of sharp tiny teeth, and hooves on its feet. While there is a resemblance, and it's the closest of what looked like what I saw, it's not exactly. The body was pretty spot on in this image. Very thick woolly hair, very brown, but the hands are different. Even though they're human hands, they had long, thick black claws at the end of each fingertip. It looked very abnormal looking. The arms were a little bit longer. The legs, just like the body and arms, very thick, very muscular, very oversized. And the head looks similar, but not at all like the picture. It was more elongated, not set in like the creature displayed, and it had more of a mouth and face like a canine, but didn't look canine, if that makes sense. The eyes were more sunken in, were more pronounced, and the horns were not at all white or curled back like a ram's horns. They were more like a gazelle, like I said, and twisted and gnarled and pointed upwards, and were black. The teeth also weren't like that in the picture. They weren't tiny and sharp. They were large and looked more like dinosaur teeth, to be honest with you, than anything else. Something you truly expect to see on a monster. I'm truly grateful that my father, to my knowledge, never had to see it or deal with it, and that was the last time that I ever saw it myself. Oh, and one last thing. A few months after I moved away, he actually ended up having that shed torn down and rebuilt a new one about probably 40 feet away from the house, closer to the barn, but closer to the house, so he could access his tools easier. I wonder why he didn't just do that initially. A very terrifying night I had, back years ago, when I was backpacking by myself around Twin Falls, Idaho, in the woods, not another soul around for miles. I was completely isolated and alone. I'm also very aware and knowledgeable about the wildlife of the area that I'm stepping into, so I didn't go into this unprepared or ignorant. I had bear mace, a knife, even a 9mm, just in case. You can never be too sure out here. This would have been probably my third night. Everything was very normal. Keep in mind, though, that I'm the only soul around for miles. I'm up in the mountains, and there's no reason there should be anybody out here. So, I turn in for the night, and I wake up, sometime in the early morning hours, to this deep, heavy breathing. Imagine somebody the size of a giant, and who's also been a lifetime smoker. It almost had a deep wheeze quality every time the breath exhaled. I froze right in my sleeping bag, thinking there's somebody here outside my tent, looking for something. It stood there for what felt like forever, just stayed there stationary, heavy breathing. Then it began moving around my tent, knocking over supplies, throwing all my stuff around, grunting, and making a very heavy noise. Every time it took a step on the ground, I could tell this was not a person. It was incredibly heavy. It kind of just took its time, making its way around my camp, and at one point, got really up close to my tent, even grabbed a hold of the zipper, and was messing around with it. Pulled it down about halfway, slowly, like it was going to go into my tent. I was petrified, and then it just stopped, and everything became completely silent. I lay there for about another hour, didn't hear anything, expecting this thing to either rip the door open and charge in and grab me, or just nothing. I eventually fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, and was jolted awake by my instant memories of what happened. I shot up, grabbed my firearm, and ran outside, being very aware of my surroundings. The sun was now up, and my campsite was trashed. All my supplies were thrown everywhere. Stuff was torn up. My tent was left alone. And this horrible odor lingered in the air. It smelled like a mix between a rotting carcass that had been sitting in the sun for days on end, so rotting nasty meat, wet dog, and this awful skunky odor. It was incredibly musty, the most musty I've ever smelt in my life. It was so much so that it was overpowering to the point to where it made me gag. The smell was all around my campsite. I cut my losses right there, packed up everything, and headed back towards civilization, to where I felt safe, and around animals and creatures and nature that I was familiar with. What was supposed to be a 7-day hike out in the Idaho mountains by myself ended up only being about 3 or 4 days. It probably saved my life. My grandfather is full native and is from the Choctaw tribe. He actually has a ton of scary stories from growing up around the res, but one that I'll share with you today is when he was about 13 or 14. He was out with his father doing something in the woods, probably gathering firewood, if I can remember right, when he says that he felt something watching him. He brushed it off, continued splitting wood, I believe, and when he finally looked over and stopped ignoring his senses, he sees this massive head sticking out of the thicket with large horns staring at him. The words he used to describe it were scary and ugly, and said that it had really nasty sharp teeth, like they were yellow and rotten with bits of black all over them. Said the eyes were a very dull yellow and had very tiny black pupils. It really scared my grandfather for a long time, but he had already had run-ins with the paranormal, aliens supposedly, and all other sorts of crazy paranormal happenings where he was living. So this was really just another branch on the tree, so to speak. I had tried doing some research to see if I can find any Native American folklore or legend that fits the description of what he gave me, but the only thing I could come across was Goatman, and I don't think that's what he saw. He also explained that whatever this thing was, poking its head through the thick brush, it was very tall, well over 8 or 9 feet, and that the head was incredibly massive. I think he just thought it was some sort of demon coming for him. His father, also being a believer, you might say superstitious, whatever you want to call it. My grandfather told his father, my great-grandfather, they didn't waste any time. They got in the truck and they left. Before I go, another crazy story from my grandfather. When he was about 18, 19, or 20, it was in the fall, and he was tracking this really large buck. He came to this spot in the woods where he had good eyes on it, and as he got ready to make the shot, this large, Bigfoot-like creature comes out of nowhere, grabs the buck by the neck, twists and breaks its neck like it was a small bird, virtually effortlessly, then just grabs the buck by the back legs, throws it over its shoulder, and casually walks off. Scared my grandfather pretty badly too. He took off. My grandfather's tribe, the Choctaw people, have a name that they call these Bigfoot creatures, but forgive me, because I can't remember it at the moment, but he knows what he saw. He has also seen them growing up, so he knew what it was. I'll reach out to him and see if I can't get him to document or write down a bunch of his experiences and encounters. I think you would really appreciate them, and if anything, really enjoy them. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Have a wonderful day. Hello. I have been following your channel for a few weeks now, after a colleague suggested that I listen to your content to perhaps get an idea of what it is that I encountered. I have never believed in the supernatural or cryptids, but I'm at a loss of what happened to me. A little background. I'm a 15-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. I have been deployed overseas multiple times, to which I have been shot at many times. I do not get shaken easily in high-stress situations, and am not prone to panic. On top of this, I have also been camping since I was 9 years old, and by 15, solo camping for extensive periods. I have camped in every season, and have had many encounters with wildlife, such as wolves, black and brown bears, cougars, lynx, moose, etc. just to give you an idea. I'm telling you all of this to give you a reference to not only my credibility and my experience, but my ability to keep calm under pressure. I have told very few people the events of what truly happened, as I wish to keep what I can of my career. So, with that said, you can share this story with whoever you think might be able to help. But please, keep my email and personal info confidential. I don't want to be posted all over social media. So, to what happened. I have been going to the same property in Temagami for the past 25 years. This is a large acreage that backs onto Crown land that was owned by my late grandfather. There is a lake on this property that I have enjoyed for not only its peace and quiet, but simply its beauty. On October 9th, 2020, I traveled here for 1 week camping, before the winter hit. I typically come here twice a year, but this year, due to COVID-19, I did not get a chance until October. I arrived early in the day, and as usual, unlocked the gate and drove in the 2 kilometers, or for those counting miles, 1.24 miles. It's an old logging road, and I rode it to its end, where I got out, grabbed my gear, a 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun. Note, I only brought the shotgun due to it being fall, and the black bears around here have a tendency to get a bit aggressive as it's closing in on their hibernation. I left my truck for the 1.5 kilometer hike, or 1 mile hike, to the lake. The day went great. I arrived, set up my camp. The woodpile from the year before was still piled neatly, and I enjoyed the remainder of the day, just relaxing outside. As it grew dark, I sat by the fire, just appreciating the quiet. As I got up to get ready to turn in for the night, I swear, out of the corner of my eyes, I saw 2 red dull lights, about 6 to 7 feet high. When I turned my head to look, there was nothing, but I immediately had the hair on the back of my neck standing up, which at the time I shook off as just getting cold, and the dull lights, a trick of my tired, weary eyes. I proceeded to dampen the fire to go to the bathroom and get in my tent. As I lay down and turned out the light, I noticed how unusually quiet the night was. While it was fall, there still is some usual bird activity, still, and other noises. But tonight, just a very light wind, and the quiet sound of small waves gently hitting the shore. After a while, I fell asleep, but I was awoken a few hours later. I was not sure why I woke. I checked my GPS and noted it was 1:14 a.m. I then lay there for a few minutes, just relaxing, listening. At first, I heard nothing, but then I heard what I can only describe as a low, deep growl from my left 8 o'clock position. I sat up, turning my head to listen. I then hear leaves crunching, moving from my 9 o'clock towards my 11 o'clock. This movement ends with another low but deep growl. At this point, I am thinking it has to be a wolf. I proceed to gently slide out of my sleeping bag, pulling the shotgun to my side. I listen for a moment, and nothing, so I proceed to slide on my boots. I then hear another growl at my 11 o'clock again. This time, I yell to try and scare it off, or at least back. I am immediately met with what I describe as a loud, deep snarl. I immediately grab the shotgun, cocking the bolt and pointing towards the snarl. I turn on the flashlight on the gun and slowly but very cautiously unzip the door of the tent because I want eyes on the target, not firing blind. I sit in a kneeling position for at least 5 minutes. At this point, it's dead silent. but I don't hear anything. So I go to move out of the tent. I was probably no more than a quarter way out of the tent when something grabs my left arm, and it wasn't a bite. It was a grab, like it was a steel vise. It proceeds faster than I could process to pull me out and to the left of the tent. The shotgun goes off in a loud bang, and this creature or animal does what I best describe as a roar and scream, and starts swinging me around. I feel intense pain in my head, then nothing. Next thing I know, it's daylight out. I wake to severe pain on my left shoulder, which I am slumped against on the ground. I manage to sit up myself. I go to rub my left eye, which I can't seem to open, and am met with excruciating pain in my left arm. I look down with my open right eye to see my shoulder sitting a good 3 inches lower than it should be. I use my right arm to peel the caked blood out of my eyelashes of my left eye. At this point, I'm assessing the situation. The first thing I realize is I'm not near my campsite, and I could see drag marks from where I was obviously dragged through the forest. I do a quick look and feel over the rest of my body with my right hand. Everything is good, other than my left arm, and the massive cut above my left eye and upper scalp. Noting that I am not actively bleeding anywhere else, so I proceed to go get up. I check my GPS watch, which is thankfully on the right hand, so it's functioning. I am astonished to find that I am well over a kilometer or half a mile away from my campsite. At this point, I'm thinking that I cannot go back to the campsite, so I set my GPS to the truck, which thankfully is only about 750 meters away. Thank God for small miracles. As I start slowly walking, holding my left arm with my right, I get a constant feeling of being watched, which I don't know was just adrenaline or actually being watched. For the entirety of the walk, the forest remains ungodly silent, and the feeling just will not shake. I arrive at my truck, and as I am getting in the truck, I hear this loud roar again. I grab the keys from the console and peel out of there, not caring for the suspension or anything else on my vehicle. I head to the nearest hospital, and after being told I require immediate surgery on my left arm and need to be moved to a better equipped hospital. On further examination, it is also found minor cuts on my hand, neck, and face. The cut on my forehead and scalp was glued, as it was too late to stitch close. So yeah, it's now a really nasty scar. I have a major concussion, and my lower left forearm is massively bruised, with a bruise that is 6 inches wide and wraps around my entire forearm. No puncture made. Key note here. After the surgery, where they fix extensive damage to most of the torn muscle in my shoulder joint and repair cartilage damage, the very best they can, the police arrive to take a statement. Their results, bear attack. A freaking bear attack, and my arm has no puncture marks. Seriously? Last I checked, unless this bear had no teeth, or it had hands rather than paws, there's no way it's a bear. Within a few days, both my brother and father went back to the campsite. They found it completely destroyed. The tent, pack, clothes, sleeping bag, all shredded. The shotgun stock split in half and barrel bent to almost a 90-degree angle. My cast iron frying pan bent on a 45-degree angle. The woodpile was thrown around everywhere. My brother and father said they didn't see or hear anything, but the entire time they were there, they too felt like they were being closely watched by something. Side note, both of them are also avid hunters. None of my family has ever felt the feeling like they were in unwanted territory at this point. That's how my father described it, like they were unwanted at this property, that they were wanting to get out. To date, I am slowly making a recovery, but have a permanent mobility loss of 30% and constant nerve pain from this. My career is now limited, and I am clueless to what really happened. I've never been afraid of the forest, but I do dread going back there and have nightmares almost nightly now, so I have to take medication to sleep. If you or anybody else has any ideas, please let me know, as at the very least, I want to know what might have attacked me, and why. Why did it let me live?